This is an LA Times Studios podcast.
From the Los Angeles Times, I'm Sammy Roth. This is Boiling Point. It wasn't so long ago that when people thought about global warming, they pictured melting ice sheets and rising seas. Back before wildfires got so destructive and droughts and storms got so intense, there was a lot of focus on polar bears and sea level rise. In retrospect, that might explain why it was so difficult to motivate people to care about the climate crisis. Rising seas are a slow-moving disaster. In California, it's taken 100 years for the Pacific Ocean to rise just 8 inches. That might not sound like a lot. But here's the thing. For every inch the Pacific Ocean rises, there is much greater potential for damage during the next storm, the next flood, the next high tide. As my LA Times colleague Rosanna Xia wrote a few years back, the coastline is eroding with every tide and storm, but everything built before we knew better. Pacific Coast Highway, multi-million-dollar homes in Malibu, the rail line in San Diego, is fixed in place with nowhere to go. The world is getting hotter, the great ice sheets still melting, the rising ocean a slow-moving disaster that has already swept past California's front door. Seaside cliffs are crumbling in Pacifica, bringing down entire buildings. From here on out, sea level rise is only going to accelerate. California and the rest of the world need to adapt, starting yesterday. The same thing is true for all the consequences of climate change. The wildfires that devastated Los Angeles this month are a painful reminder of that fact. The Eaton and Palisades fires have burned more than 37,000 acres, killing 29 people and destroying more than 16,000 homes and other buildings. The air quality has been terrible. The cost of the damages and economic losses is likely to surpass $250 billion. To be clear, the fires weren't caused by climate change, but climate change did make them worse. And even if we do everything scientists say we should be doing to replace fossil fuels with cleaner energy, global warming isn't going away entirely. We need to find ways to survive and thrive in this ever more dangerous world created by fossil fuel pollution. My name is Sammy Roth, and I'm the climate columnist for the Los Angeles Times. This week's episode of Boiling Point is about sea level rise. And just so you know, we recorded it a few weeks before the Los Angeles fires. But these two topics are very much connected. What they have in common is that they signal the importance of adaptation. We need to rethink how we live and work and build our cities to deal with a changing climate. Our guest this week, our guide for this conversation, is my LA Times colleague Rosanna Xia. I'm lucky to work with her because she is one of the country's very best environmental journalists. We sat down at the LA Times office in El Segundo to talk about her book, California Against the Sea, Visions for Our Vanishing Coastline, which is all about adapting to sea level rise. It was just named the 2024 winner of the Penn E.O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award. It also received a gold medal from the California Book Award. I hope our conversation will make you want to go read Rosanna's book. But for the sake of context, one of the key takeaways is that climate adaptation is hard. People have built mansions and restaurants and scenic highways all up and down the California coast. Everyone loves our beaches. The idea that we might have to pull back from parts of the coast, it's a tough sell. Even just talking about redesigning our houses and beachfronts can be challenging. We'll be having similar conversations here in LA County as we rebuild after the fires. There are difficult choices ahead. Here's my conversation with Rosanna. Rosanna Xia, welcome to the Boiling Point podcast.
Hey, Sammy. Excited to see you turning Boiling Point into a podcast. Very cool.
It's been pretty fun so far. So, Rosanna, remind me, how long have you been reporting on the coast now?
Oh, gosh.
So long that you can't even remember?
7 or 8 years. I feel like my post-COVID brain doesn't think of time the same way. Yeah, 7 or 8 years. And I've been covering general environment for 12, 13 years,
so
2010,
7 or 8 years on the coast. Do you ever get tired of it?
No. I mean, it's like, my job, like as the coastal ocean reporter for the LA Times, my range is like the entire California coast. So that's Oregon all the way to Mexico. That's just the outer coast. And that's like 1,290 something miles, depending on who you talk to. And then also the entire inner San Francisco Bay shoreline, which is hundreds of more miles. And then I also have like the entire ocean. And so I'm definitely not running out of story ideas. And I think actually the hardest part of my job is figuring out what stories to say no to so that I can dedicate like my 1,000% energy into, a few stories that can really help deepen and expand the way we think about these less tangible spaces. And every time I'm out on the beach, and it's like, yeah, I have a great job. I get to go to the beach a lot. And, also wetlands, I feel like, are also part of my kind of range of coverage because I truly consider wetlands as part of the coast and all these intertidal spaces. But I mean, every time I'm out at the beach, it's different. The beach is never the same twice. And I think there's just something so incredible about that. And I have not lost my sense of wonder every time I go out there.
No matter how many times I hear you say that 1,290 some odd mile statistic, I never get tired of it.
I mean, you should see the spreadsheets on how I try to keep track of every city council, schedule. And it's interesting. It's like, a couple dozen cities and counties, and then also regional joint powers authorities, federal agencies, fisheries, NOAA. Yeah, there's just a lot of agencies I'm constantly kind of checking in on. And then just also the marine science research institutions in the state are absolutely incredible. So it's, yeah. And then I joke with my editor every time I get too deep into something like really intensely controversial or complicated, because I feel like I'm such a masochist for complicated stories. I'm like, I need to write a happy story about a jellyfish. And he said, it's time to go write a story about a sea otter or a jellyfish.
Gosh, it's been more than a year now since I read your book, California Against the Sea, which is crazy because it feels like it just came out yesterday. But you've got a paperback edition now and an audio book, and you've been all over the country touring and doing book talks, and it's amazing. And I guess and you've gotten so much recognition for this book, which is incredible. I want to ask you, why do you think there has been such a strong reaction and so many people have responded so positively and so strongly to this book? I mean, what do you think it is that's making people so hungry to read about this topic, about sea level rise and about the consequences of climate change?
I mean, I will say, something that has really hit me while, I was on the road, it was just, really realizing that there are just so many people out there who have been wanting to have this conversation about climate change, about climate adaptation, about our future, and they just didn't quite know where to start. And I think, you and I, we are living and breathing these issues all the time. We're talking to people all the time who are also living and breathing these issues. But for me, being in these book talks, at bookstores and libraries, at universities, also art museums and kind of the art community and the filmmaking community, it just really allowed me to meet folks in a way that felt different and more expansive in some ways. I love the sense of communities in particular that libraries and local bookstores, for example, inherently have already built. And so just kind of entering these spaces and just having the book as a gentle way in with a built-in community that, was curious and willing to talk and ask questions in a place that didn't feel like you were on blast at an intense city council or planning commission meeting, or you were kind of at a protest. There were just all these different, it provided a new way for folks to ask the questions that they've been wanting to ask. And I just feel like we ended up talking about these issues and getting to the heart of it just from a different way. And so that was really powerful to me, realizing just how many more people out there are ready and willing to have this conversation.
What are you hearing from people? I mean, what are the questions that you're getting asked? What are the themes? What do people want to talk with you about when you're there talking about your book?
Yeah, I mean, a question that I have been getting a lot is, how do we get more people to prioritize and care about an issue like sea level rise. I get this a lot, especially when I'm, on the coast in these coastal communities. And the question kind of like, how do we fit this into kind of the broader suite of competing priorities? We talk about drought a lot in California. Wildfire is ever present.
Building housing, too, for sure.
And I was going to say homelessness, housing, employment, teacher shortages, like there are also all these other, quote unquote, I'm using air quotes, like non-related climate issues that are also pressing to the state. And my first answer is it's all related. It's all connected, and climate change touches every aspect of our lives. And because it touches every aspect of our lives, climate solutions can also support and be interconnected to the way we think about the future and how we move into the future. And, I think I'm not running into climate deniers as much in the field, in these communities, in kind of my day-to-day conversations. I really think the debate in California is not whether or not climate change is real, it's how much time we have. This notion of, is this something that we should have started generations ago? Some people would say absolutely. Other people are still thinking not in my lifetime. And some of these longer-term planning decisions that we're now pushing for, that the state's trying to start conversations on, that, some folks are, really advocating for. A lot of folks are saying, this is all premature. So kind of navigating this sense of time. And what's fascinating to me, too, as a storyteller, is just realizing that we are so often forced to make decisions in, time frames that at the end of the day feel pretty arbitrary when you think about what makes sense for nature, right? 30-year mortgages, 4-year political cycles. And so this issue of time and this theme of time really continue to reveal itself and unfold in the course of reporting for this book and also talking to folks after the book came out.
Well, something you do a really good job of in your book is, I think, illustrating that this is not an issue that's just about the future, some 2050 or 2080 or 2099 timeframe where the sea is going to be a foot or 3 feet or 5 feet higher, that the consequences of rising seas from greenhouse gas emissions, we're dealing with this right now. I remember when you and I spoke about the book the first time in, September of 2023 when it had just come out, you said that you had had conversations with people along the coast, with scientists just a few years earlier when you'd been reporting the book, talking about we're going to have a year, at some point in the future when there's a real bad king tide and when there are really bad coastal storms, when there's going to be huge, terrible flooding along the coast. And hey, then that happened in January of 2023, and that was even sooner than people expected. This is a problem now, right?
Yeah, and I think, the term that comes up a lot in the sea level rise, policy and science space is slow-moving disaster, right? And it's not as in your face per se on a day-to-day basis as like a wildfire, for example. And you can't stand on the beach for one afternoon and really feel the like intense urgency of sea level rise in this looming disaster, but it is present. And it kind of hits you in these ways that where the ocean moves in, things get flooded, then you're reminded of like the immense power of the ocean. And then the next day the sun comes out. And I think to keep the momentum on an issue like sea level rise is challenging, right? Because we do have these seasons, but something that is becoming more present is just this notion that we have less time than we think. Every time we think we have more time, something like the January 2023 storms in Northern California is a humbling reminder that we aren't prepared and that there is so much that we should be better prepared for.
These conversations that you've had, the desire to talk about climate change and adapting and to make it more of a priority, is that just in California, or are you seeing that in other parts of the country too?
I'm definitely seeing it in all the spaces that I'm going to. And I think climate change, capital C, can feel very, very overwhelming.
That's part of what I was wondering, because, you're right, you use those terms, and I'm sure there are places where that immediately kind of shuts people's brains off.
Yeah, and I would say that it's, this is a conversation too about flooding. It's a conversation about our relationship to the ocean. I think that more than anything has also resonated with folks. Like everyone has a story about the first time they went to the beach or the first time they put their toes in the sand and stood on the edge of, this living body of water that reminds you that we live on a planet, right? A massive planet with all of these incredible dynamic wonders. And I think having the conversation start there too, as like, here is a book that is inviting you to rethink or to reconsider or to expand kind of your notion of what it means to live with the ocean, to live at the very edges of the sea, I think has been also a really inspiring way to have this conversation that ultimately arrives at some of the same endpoints, but you're just starting in a different place.
Do you find that it's possible to have conversations with people who maybe don't see the world the same way that you do in terms of what we need to do to address climate change in a rapid fashion? I mean, do you have conversations that are productive with people who might see things a little bit differently?
One thing I'll start by saying is, and I really appreciate you asking this question, because I think first and foremost, we can't move forward without everyone, on all sides of this issue engaged. And I think something that I have found myself reflecting on and, saying to folks in different communities is like, even the angriest person in your town on this issue, the person who is considered, quote unquote, on the opposing side of a very important vote or something, like that person is engaged. And I think the engagement is key. And I think that more than anything, as the question that I've also been getting asked a lot is like, what surprised you the most in the process of writing this book? And I think, the first time I was ever asked that question, I was like, thinking out loud live on stage. And I realized as I was searching through the recesses of my memories of like what actually floored me, it was kind of reaching this point of realization a couple of years in that there was so much more commonality in what people were saying to me than differences. And it took, layers of listening and peeling back kind of like the surface level talking points of folks. But everyone I talked to chose to live by the ocean for a reason. Everyone I talked to loves and connects deeply to what it means to be Californian. And I think that everyone cares on, again, back to the point on engagement, like everyone cares. And I think kind of getting to that point of realizing that a community is a community for all the different types of people who live there, and how do we bridge these conversations and see each other as neighbors again, I think is really, really important. Like, I remember just like going to this town where the issue of sea level rise was so controversial, and a bunch of people in town were like, oh, don't talk to that person. That person's really angry and really a denier and all these things. And then I'm walking on the beach with this person and they're picking up trash as we're talking. Someone else that I talked to in a different town is also like planting native plants in their garden and also trying to save all the animals on their street. And so it's like, I think there are just these small moments of humanity that I want to somehow re-index on and help people see each other as neighbors again. And I think another thing that I'll just add here, and I might have geeked out on this with you already in the newsroom, but, I heard Naomi Klein say on a podcast last year, and she's, the author of so many great books on climate change and the intersections of capitalism. And her most recent book is on conspiracy theories. And she said something on a podcast that has been stuck in my mind ever since. She said, conspiracy theorists get the facts wrong and the emotions right. And that's why.
Oh, that's so interesting.
And that's why so many conspiracy theories tend to take off or like build like, and I think that just really floored me, because it made me realize that so often the way we talk about climate change and climate policy is grounded in the facts. That's so important. But also, I think it's really critical to acknowledge the emotions that people are feeling. And so for me, like in the field, in the process of writing this book, and in the process of sharing this book with the world in the past year, I think recognizing sometimes we need to start the conversation with the emotions. How are you feeling? Why are you angry? Why are you scared? What are you worried about? What's keeping you up at night? And validating those feelings, like whatever someone is feeling, even if it's based in facts that are wrong or based in an opinion that you or someone else disagrees with, doesn't negate the fact that someone is feeling this way. And so I think by starting the conversation there and then slowly building those bridges towards shared facts that we can agree on and honoring how people are feeling, I've realized is so important, and really listening first and foremost in your first few conversations with someone on just why they're feeling a certain way, I think really led to a different kind of conversation that helped me see so much commonality again between people from all sides of the issue.
So everything you're saying really resonates with me this month with the inauguration with Donald Trump taking office, because as someone who writes about climate change and writes about energy, who very badly wants to see progress on this stuff. That's why I write about it. The idea that there's space for us all to really come together and find common ground. I mean, it just makes sense. I mean, I think you're right that across party lines, across ideologies, that deep down people really do care and want a planet that's healthy, that's safe, that we can live on in harmony, right? I mean,
and no one wants to see their children hurt. No
No.
one wants to see their children, unhealthy.
right. And
Those are all common values.
For sure. And I think on a practical level, just watching how things have played out politically, the idea that going back and forth between 4 years of, whether they're perfect or not, of Congress passing climate and clean energy laws, and then 4 years of the next administration doing everything they can to reverse them, and then going back and forth between that, that's not a sustainable system for building a healthy climate and reversing sea level rise and worsening wildfires and heat waves and droughts. I mean, so the idea of everyone managing to find common ground and build sustainable success together, that seems like a lot better recipe for success, and sort of mirrors, I think, a lot of the conversations that are happening within the Democratic Party about, what could they do to sort of stop this from happening again. So that's interesting to me. I guess the part where I struggle is from a practical standpoint. One, the sort of timelines we're dealing with climate change, where there's a really strong need based on the science to reduce emissions very, very quickly, and building consensus and bringing people together takes a lot of time. And two, I wonder what happens when you need to actually start making hard decisions. I mean, thinking about sea level rise, what happens when you need to get to the point of, okay, do we build a wall here, or do we need to retreat from this spot? With an election, do we elect a politician who's a climate denier who we might like for other reasons, or do we elect a politician who wants to pass really aggressive climate and clean energy policies? So I'd like to think that you're onto something here with what you've seen doing the talks for this book and hearing from people, that we can get to that point eventually. But I do kind of, this is me pushing back a little bit, I guess. I just wonder, do you feel hopeful that we can get to a point where the folks who are living along the coast, where they could ultimately reach an agreement and say, okay, fine, we might not see eye to eye, but I get it. I need to pull back from this spot. Or someone else might say, okay, maybe this isn't the right spot to defend. Maybe from a rational standpoint, we shouldn't be defending this spot, but someone cares about it, so we'll build a seawall and give up on the beach here.
Yeah. And I've always loved how much you're a realist. And I think if I had put myself on the spectrum of things, I feel like I'm more of a optimist. Or I guess maybe I'm not an optimist, but I think that, a few thoughts here, and my mind is going a mile a minute.
And I know that I just kind of went all over the map with that, but I tried to ground it back into a practical question for you.
I love this. I think, one thing that I've found really powerful is kind of reframing this conversation about sea level rise. And I'll kind of stick to like the world of sea level rise adaptation, but just reframing kind of this conversation of adapting. Like, what do we do about sea level rise as not a conversation about centered around what it is that we have to give up in order to survive or to be, quote unquote, resilient as a community. Can we frame this conversation instead as an opportunity to think about what it is that we can build towards? And, I've been to a number of communities that have been more effective in starting these planning conversations, where it's not starting the conversation with, here is the scary flood map, and here is the problem, and here is all of the solutions that we need to vote on now in order to not have the scary blue line cross into this neighborhood, right? And so there's that form of that conversation versus, hey, let's get together and figure out what the problem is together. And then I've heard, literally I saw a city planner once start a conversation with what do you want your community to look like 30, 40, 50 years from now? Starting there rather than, should we build a seawall or not? Should we restore this neighborhood or not? Should we clean this up or not at the expense of blah, 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 blah. But just kind of blanket conceptual question of what do you value as a community? What do you want to have? What does a thriving community look like to you a few decades from now? And I thought that was really interesting. I think, and Sammy, your pieces have, every time I read something that you write, it makes me think about, the need for compromise, right? And I think that is, and the power and importance of compromise in a world where compromise has felt increasingly less achievable. And I think what's interesting, I'm I tell this story a lot to journalism students, but, like years ago, the night before my first like big story, I couldn't sleep. I called my editor. Thank goodness you picked up at 11 p.m. And I was just like all nerves. And my editor was like, Rosanna, tomorrow when your story runs, if every single person you quoted in that story chews you out just a little bit, hates you just a little bit, nitpicks something, like, thank you for my quote, but why did you have to talk to this person? He's like, that means you were fair. That means that you didn't follow a single person's agenda and that you listened to all sides and you compromised, right? And I think, and I shared this story with a planner once too, and, coastal planners are all like, yep, that's exactly what the planning process is, but you've reached a good plan when everyone hates you. And I'm like, why did we sign up for this job?
My metric is usually either everyone's unhappy or everyone's happy. It's got to be one of those.
Right. And so like, and then the thing I kind of tell journalism students in the story is like the flip side of this, many years later, as I like started to like learn my own style of reporting, is just like, your story comes out and everyone quoted in the story somehow feels heard. Thank you for talking to me and listening to me. I didn't really agree. I don't know why you had to talk to that person, but thank you for getting my section right. And I think that's really important. Like, what is fairness? What is compromise? And ultimately, did everyone feel heard? And kind of going back to the coastal planners that I also talked to, it's interesting. I do feel like there's a lot of funny, interesting parallels between people who are in kind of city planning and state planning and just kind of like the idea of planning a landscape and a community for the future and also journalism. But this planner told me, planning moves at the speed of trust. And I think I've also been thinking about that statement quite a bit as it applies to journalism. I think we do need to build trust with the people that we're having conversations with. And I also think that a community has a better shot at moving forward, at planning together, if we actually trust the people that we're working with and the people who are being presented to us as experts. And I think that trust building takes time. And going back to like one of the first points in our discussion today, like we're running out of time. And so I think that all of the points that you're raising are really, really important. And I don't have a clear answer. And I think that also, like, Sammy, I feel like you are also really, I'm curious to hear, like, more of your thinking along the lines of compromise, because, like, you've definitely, Sammy, given folks some pretty tough love in the past. One of your columns that just popped into mind is the one that got selected recently for the Best American Science and Nature Writing series. But just, like, I'm curious how you navigate this idea of, like, how people have to think about things as we really get to the end of the road on a really tough decision.
Oh, gosh. Well, I mean, it's like you were saying earlier, the way the world works these days, it just kind of drives polarization and drives a desire to not compromise, unfortunately. I mean, the way social media works, the way politics has devolved, I mean, the lack of trust in media, the lack of trust in us, it drives a desire to not compromise, to just be pushed towards the more extreme positions. I mean, I feel it myself sometimes. I have to fight against my own instinct to see comments on my Twitter or X feed and to be pushed towards, the pole rather than towards the, not the center necessarily, but towards the maybe more practical or compromised position that I would like to sort of maintain. So yeah, no, I do try in my writing when the column you were referring to, I think had to do with solar development on public lands in the desert, and sort of needing to be able to accept that some amount of this is going to be necessary to build the amount of renewable energy that we need to get rid of fossil fuels and slow down the climate crisis to the extent necessary. And there's a lot of people who don't want to hear that, who understandably live in the desert, care about public lands, and want to protect them to the fullest extent possible, even though there's a lot of science and research showing that from a practical standpoint, getting greenhouse gas emissions down to the levels we need to get them to fast enough, it's just probably not going to happen any other way except with a very large amount of large-scale solar development, and that one of the best ways to do that, economically speaking, within the capitalist system that we have, involves building on public lands near transmission lines, which in a lot of cases is in the desert where the solar resource is best, where you can get it to cities like Los Angeles. So this is what I focus on in my writing. And so it's, I grapple with the same things that you're grappling with, which is, thinking ahead to what is the best version of society that we can have, and then sort of backtracking towards the present day and thinking, okay, what are the choices that we need to make today that might get us there? And I don't know, is the way that I write about it, am I taking too firm a hand? Should I be gentler? Should I be trying to sort of ease people along towards that point rather than maybe saying, like, you guys need to just wrap your heads around this and go along with it now, because you're right. Sometimes there's a pretty strong backlash to that. But also I frequently will get people who nod along and say, yeah, you're right. Thank you for saying that. I'm not sure what the right answer is.
I point to that essay of yours as like your tough love column that I share with folks. And I think it's interesting. You have one line, if I remember correctly, from that column, like, in an ideal universe, this, and this would happen. In an ideal universe, we can kind of make these decisions that, have such clean costs and trade-offs and stuff. But you're like, we don't live in an ideal universe. You're like, we live in a universe where, reality check, we use a ton of energy, and that's not changing, in the foreseeable future. Like,
and in your case, we live in a universe where there's been a ton of development up and down the coast, and where people very much would like to stay there, I imagine. And there's a lot of hard choices.
We live in a universe where we have settled a shoreline, the California coast, one of the most iconic shorelines in the world, arguably, and we have, the California identity is now inseparable from our coastal lifestyle, our coastal, like our connection to the coast. And I think one of the most, and we talked about this last year too, one of the most fundamental like mind shifts for me in the process of writing this book is realizing that the coast is not a place. It's a process, right? And so many people today still think of the coast as static, as this place that, you build something on, you build a community, a road, anything, and it's supposed to be there. And the beach is supposed to be there every time you go back to said place along the coast. But, earlier I was saying, like, you can stand on a beach for one afternoon and not really feel the urgency of sea level rise. You can stand on a beach for one afternoon and look at that tide line, and that tide line, that line in the sand, is different every time the waves crash ashore. And then you turn around and you look at Pacific Coast Highway, you look at, all of the built infrastructure in our built environment, and like we have like tried to fix a line in the sand, so to speak, along a dynamic zone that is actually supposed to be constantly in motion with each other. Like, there's this constant give and take between land and ocean that we've become blinded to based on the way we've built the California coast. And you're right, like, in some ways, like, the beach is so important to the California identity, but also kind of the coastal living aspects. And I think there's a lot of harmony in those shared needs and wants, but there's also tension. And I think that recognizing kind of the big picture and then being able to dive back into the parcel by parcel, city by city, landscape by landscape, ecosystem by ecosystem kind of approach is really, really important.
It just finally occurred to me after 10 years of writing about climate change, but just the word change is right there in the name, and it's not just that the environment that we live in is changing and that's hard to accept, but our own ability to change with it. That's very hard to do, and it seems fundamental because it's right there in the name, but the ability to keep up with the changes that are happening around us. I mean, humans don't like to change, especially at the speed at which things are changing around us. I mean, that's just fundamentally going to be difficult, especially on top of fossil fuel industry obstructionism, et cetera. But that seems to be at the heart of what's going on, I think.
Yeah, and how do we help people not be afraid of change, or to at least see change as not something to resist, but perhaps an opportunity? Because, and something I find myself saying a lot nowadays is just like, change, our fear of change means that we are accepting the status quo, right? Mm-hmm. And like, I keep hearing people say like, oh my God, like I wish like things went back to normal, and like this sense of wanting normalcy as a form of stability. But who does normal serve? And by maintaining the status quo, that's kind of implying that you think that this world that we live in now is the best version that we can get, and I think that the best version of what we have. And I think for a lot of folks that I talk to, in communities that we would define as environmental justice communities, for example, the status quo has not been serving them for generations. And I think if you think about all the folks who don't necessarily benefit from normal, like this idea that we're not trying to change and we're trying to hold on to what we have today, like that in itself is a failure of imagination in some ways, and a failure of just recognizing that we can do better. And it's not just kind of this better of like, we need to fix climate change or respond to climate change. I think, again, in the process of responding to climate change, acknowledging climate change and adapting to climate change, there are so many other things we could fix and make better along the way for so many people in this world.
Well, I agree with that, and I think there are a lot of people who agree with that. I imagine, and tell me if I'm getting this wrong, but I would imagine that probably most of the conversations you're having with people who have read your book, maybe they're not necessarily people who are out there crusading about climate change, but there's still people who are going and choosing to spend their spare time reading a nonfiction book about sea level rise and showing up at bookshops and art museums, et cetera. They may not be people who are prone to – I mean, they're going to be people who are probably going to hear environmental justice communities and think, oh, yeah, I want to help those people. I guess what I'm getting at is that I still am a little bit skeptical at the idea that this is something that, you can bring everyone on board with totally, that, hey, we can change the world for the better for everyone. Isn't that great?
I think step one is to get more people engaged in this conversation and to expand who might think they belong to this conversation. I was kind of humbled just realizing the number of people who didn't realize that they did have a say in sea level rise adaptation, for example. In my reporting process, like folks who lived further inland were like, oh, I don't own a home on the beach. This is not my problem to think about. I'm worried about jobs. I'm worried about air pollution and the freeway cutting through my community. But like all of these are also climate change issues. And I think, so step one for me is thinking about how to expand the universe of who is engaged and empowered to speak on this issue. And then also like kind of recalibrating and expanding our notion of who can be seen as an expert in this conversation. We absolutely need the scientists. We absolutely need engineers with engineering licenses and coastal planners who have really given so much thought to this. But also I think kind of thinking through, like, can we honor somehow the perspective of someone who's lived on the beach for generations, who has seen firsthand all of the changes? And if we only, was willing to listen with respect and actually honoring kind of what that perspective can provide in this conversation. Also I've been thinking a lot about where Indigenous knowledge fits in and where the kind of lived experiences of frontline communities fit in. Stories that don't necessarily have the hard data, quote unquote, to back something up, but are, points of data and expertise in its own right. And so I think, again, like there are a lot of folks that I ran into in the reporting process who, didn't necessarily think immediately that they had anything to say about this issue. And again, it's like, where do we start the conversation and how do we start it? That's something I've been thinking a lot about as a reporter and a writer. And then, post book coming out, I've also thinking about how do we continue this conversation with folks and how do we continue to bring even more people into this conversation and to have every single person feel like what they have to say matters and what they have to say is in itself critical to the way we think and understand this issue.
I love that. I could keep having this conversation with you all day, and I hope that we can keep having this conversation on many future occasions, maybe even on a future podcast. Before we wrap things up, I do want to ask, I hear you're working on a documentary, or I hear you've done a documentary. Tell us about that. Where can people maybe see it? What can you say? What can you say?
Oh my gosh. Where do I even start?
I hear you haven't been sleeping, maybe?
I have definitely not slept in a very, very, very long time. So real briefly, I'll just, say that as I was doing all this reporting on sea level rise and thinking about our future, I was also starting in parallel to unravel this like mind-blowing story about our past. So I got this really surreal tip a couple years ago from a renowned scientist at UC Santa Barbara, Dr. David Valentine. He's, has access to all of this like incredible deep sea technology. And with this like deep sea underwater robot, he came across these like really eerie looking barrels on the seafloor just off the coast between Santa Monica and Catalina. And I'm sure some folks listening probably remember that first story, but it was like, oh my God, what is that barrel? How did it get there? And just the story of that barrel became the tip of the iceberg to this really just haunting history of all of the toxic chemicals that we've dumped into the ocean in the 40s and 50s before, back when we thought the ocean could be treated as the world's biggest landfill. And so the story really just kind of engage folks on, again, I think one of the themes of like my writing is just kind of helping people reconnect and reconsider our relationship to the ocean, because so often we are standing on land kind of feeling somewhat disconnected to this massive, massive body of water. And, at first I was like resistant to the idea of turning this into a film, but then, met this incredible independent film team, director Daniel Straub and, an immensely talented cinematographer, Daniel's brother, Austin Straub. And we also found a remarkable composer, James Ellington, who just kind of really together got to the heart and spirit of the story. And, it's been such a labor of love, but we made a feature-length documentary that I also co-directed and produced for the LA Times. And we just finally premiered it in New York back in November at Doc NYC, the largest documentary film festival in the country. And I'm excited to share that we'll be playing in California for the very first time next weekend at the Santa Barbara International Film Festival.
And the date for that is?
The weekend of February 7th to 9th.
Excellent.
And we also just found out that we'll be playing in Los Angeles later in February at the Slamdance Film Festival, which we're also super, super excited about. So there'll be 2 opportunities in the month of February in Southern California to check out the film. And both screenings, both film festivals feel so meaningful to me. And I think it's going to be, and just to see the response in New York too. I mean, this is a story that takes place in Southern California, but it is, again, the tip of the iceberg to such a bigger story about our relationship and our past disconnect to the ocean.
Yeah, maybe once the DDT documentary is available on a streaming service when people can watch it more widely, we could do a whole other episode on that, because it's really a crazy series of stories that you did. I mean, just all of those barrels of DDT that are just sitting there still off the coast of Southern California. I mean, it's wild what you uncovered in that reporting.
Yeah, and I feel like I'm still uncovering. I mean, the theme that keeps coming up every time I talk to the researchers, and it's an incredible community of marine researchers have come together and on this issue since the first article came out. But just the more we look, now that we're looking, the more we find. So I feel like this story is still ever evolving, and it was really cool to document and film so much of this process once the story started to take off. And, the film is now kind of in its festival run. So, I'm excited for the next couple of months. We've got a lot of pretty exciting film festivals lining up that we'll hopefully be able to talk more about soon.
I'm excited for you. This is amazing.
Thank you. It's been a ride, and I think that ultimately, just thinking about the story of the ocean, both as a story of the future and a story of the past, has been really profound for me. And I think, at some point when I do catch a breath and sleep for a month, I think I will be able to kind of process just the immensity of what has happened in the last few years. And I've been blown away by every single person I've met on this journey, and just really grateful for all the folks who have kept me inspired and helped expand my own understanding and thinking about how we relate to the ocean.
Well, I'm inspired by what you've done. Rosanna Xia, journalist, author, documentary filmmaker, muse of the California coast. Thank you for being with us on the Boiling Point podcast.
Thanks so much, Sammy.
One more thing about climate adaptation before we go. The Eaton and Palisades fires are mostly contained, but it'll be a long time before we understand the full extent of the pollution they've released. Not just into the air we breathe, but into the ocean. If you go to latimes.com, you'll find a story by Rosanna and our colleague Corinne Pertil about researchers tracking the smoke, soot, toxic metals, and other debris getting washed into the Pacific. We know these fires have changed our city. Soon, we'll learn how they've changed the sea. Thank you for listening to Boiling Point. I'm your host, Sammy Roth. My producers are Mary Knopf and Jonathan Shiflett. Sound design and original music by Jonathan Shiflett. Elijah Wolfson is our editor. Denise Callahan is our studio manager. Ben Church is our production manager. Nick Norton is our engineer. Special thanks to LA Times studio president Anna Magzanian, president and chief operating officer of the Los Angeles Times Chris Argentieri, and executive editor of the Los Angeles Times Terry Tang. Boiling Point is executive produced by Darius Derrickson and created by me, Sammy Roth.